Jaden Carter was never the type of kid to go unnoticed. At 14, he carried a striking presence, not because he was the tallest in class or the most popular, but because of the intensity with which he saw the world around him. His father, Colonel Marcus Carter, a respected Navy SEAL, made sure to teach him early on that life wasn't about taking the easy path, but about doing what was right, even when no one was watching. Jaden had grown up in a home where discipline and justice were as essential as breakfast. He knew that every action had weight and every choice shaped the future. On that Friday afternoon, while waiting for the bus after school, he had no idea that he was about to put these principles to the test in a way that would change his life forever. The sun was slowly hiding behind Manhattan's tall buildings, casting long shadows over the crowded sidewalks. Jaden was leaning against the bus stop, his backpack thrown on the ground, watching the city's hustle as he always did. He had a habit of noticing details that most people ignored: the way someone walked, how they held a cell phone, the glances exchanged between strangers. It was this keen instinct that made his eyes fix on the expansive glass facade of the Park Avenue Cafe. Inside, among golden light fixtures and impeccably crisp linen tablecloths, a common scene was unfolding. An older man was quietly having lunch with an incredibly beautiful and much younger woman. He didn't know who they were, but something about the way the woman moved caught his attention, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that sent a jolt of alert through his stomach. Squinting, Jaden tried to understand why that woman was triggering his alarm. There was something mechanical about her movements, a meticulous control in every gesture, as if she were rehearsing an invisible choreography. And then he saw it. A small, transparent vial slipped from her designer purse so quickly and discreetly that anyone else would have missed the moment. But Jaden saw it. He saw her pour the colorless liquid into the soup bowl in front of the man. He saw how she lightly stirred the spoon, mixing the contents as if it were just a casual gesture. His heart raced. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't just his imagination. That woman was poisoning her own husband, and no one in the restaurant seemed to notice. For a brief moment, Jaden froze. He remembered the countless times his father had spoken about the danger of inaction. Standing still and doing nothing is always the worst choice, he used to say. But what if he was wrong? What if it was just a seasoning? What if the man truly trusted that woman and Jaden was about to cause a huge embarrassment? The thought lasted less than a second before a surge of adrenaline took over his body. He knew what he had seen. He knew that if he was right and stayed silent, that man could die right there, in the middle of a crowded restaurant, never suspecting the danger. So, without further hesitation, Jaden dashed forward. He burst through the cafe doors with a shove and yelled with all the strength in his lungs, "Don't eat that." The entire restaurant froze. The clinking of cutlery against porcelain instantly ceased, as if someone had hit the pause button on reality. The silence was so absolute that Jaden could hear his own heavy breathing, his heart pounding against his ribs. All eyes turned toward him, a kid with a worn backpack and rumpled school uniform, standing in the middle of one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. But what really mattered at that moment wasn't the suspicious attention of the other customers, but the reaction of the two people seated at the table in the center of his field of vision. Richard Calloway, the man who nearly brought the soup spoon to his mouth, remained still. His blue-aged eyes narrowed in confusion, trying to process what had just happened. Vanessa Calloway, on the other hand, reacted instantly. Her perfect posture stiffened for a split second before she assumed an expression of impeccably rehearsed incredulity. With a short, elegant laugh, she turned to her husband and the other customers still frozen in the scene, raising her hands as if dealing with a troublesome child. "But what is this? Who is this boy? Someone get him out of here." Her voice was a perfect blend of exasperation and superiority, the kind of tone that dismissed an accusation without needing to really refute it. But Jaden wasn't intimidated. He felt everyone's gaze burning on him, some loaded with disapproval, others merely curious. Still, His eyes remained fixed on Richard Calloway. "I saw her put something in your soup," he said, his voice trembling but firm. His chest rose and fell rapidly, with adrenaline coursing through him. The billionaire said nothing immediately. He simply observed Jaden, then his wife. Her fingers still gripped the spoon, suspended in the air just a few centimeters from her mouth. The ensuing silence was suffocating. Vanessa, recovering from her initial shock, let out another laugh, this time a bit more forced. "This is ridiculous. He must be joking or just seeking attention." Her eyes shifted to the restaurant manager, a middle-aged man who had already started hesitantly moving toward Jaden. "Please get this boy out of here before he causes any more trouble." But something about the haste in which she reacted did not go unnoticed. Richard finally put the spoon back into the bowl and leaned back, crossing his arms. His appraising gaze fixed on Vanessa, searching for any sign of hesitation. He was a man accustomed to reading people, noticing even the smallest details in a negotiation. And now, for the first time, he wondered, what if this boy was right? The restaurant manager approached with careful steps, trying to balance authority and diplomacy in the face of the unusual situation. "Boy, you can't just come in here and make such accusations." His voice was low, but laced with impatience. Jaden felt a lump in his throat. If no one believed him, everything would have been in vain. He looked directly at Richard and raised his voice, ignoring the manager. "If nothing's wrong with your soup, then why don't you try it now?" The words slipped out before he could think, and in the next instant, an even heavier silence engulfed the room. Vanessa shifted in her chair, her impeccable composure beginning to crack. "This is absurd, Richard," she protested, flinging the linen napkin across the table. "I can't believe you're listening to this kid!" But her voice wavered slightly, a small detail that Richard instantly picked up on. For decades, he had made his fortune by spotting lies disguised as truths, and for the first time, his wife seemed nervous, not furious, not outraged, nervous. He looked at the bowl before him, and then at Vanessa. Then, like a man used to playing chess with market giants, he made the simplest yet most devastating move. "If there's nothing wrong, then you prove it." Vanessa's face paled. It was just a moment, a single second of hesitation, but for Richard, it was enough. He recognized that expression, the fear someone feels when they realize their game is over. The entire restaurant watched, and the silence turned into an unbearable pressure. Some customers murmured among themselves, while others simply held their breath, waiting for the surreal moment to unfold. Vanessa blinked quickly, trying to regain control. She forced a smile, picked up her wine glass, and took a sip before letting out a humorless laugh. "This is an outrage. You really want me to taste my own soup just to satisfy some teenager's delusion?" Richard said nothing. He only continued to look at her, impassive, while drumming his fingers on the table. His silence spoke louder than any accusation. Vanessa realized there was no escape. The pressure increased with every passing second. Her eyes darted quickly around the restaurant, as if searching for an exit. When she finally picked up the spoon, her hand trembled slightly. Jaden held his breath. If she really tasted the soup, that would mean he was wrong, but he knew he wasn't. Vanessa swirled the spoon in the bowl, yet instead of bringing it to her mouth, she let out an exaggerated sigh and tossed the spoon back, crossing her arms. "That's an insult. I refuse to participate in this farce." Her voice was firm, but her eyes said otherwise. They revealed that she was backed into a corner. Vanessa's refusal was enough to turn the tide against her. The moment she dropped the spoon and moved away from the bowl, the atmosphere in the restaurant changed. Earlier, the audience had watched with curiosity, but now something different filled the air, a tension laden with suspicion. People began whispering, exchanging looks that clearly communicated what they were thinking. Richard noticed this and, more importantly, noticed something in himself. The doubt had now become an uncomfortable certainty. He turned his gaze back to Jaden, scrutinizing the boy with a sharp look. The kid was tense, but he didn't seem to be fabricating anything. He didn't stutter, didn't show any hesitation. He was simply insisting on the truth. And then Richard did something unexpected. He raised his hand to call a waiter. "Bring another bowl of soup, identical to this one." His voice was calm but laden with authority. The waiter hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to obey or wait for Vanessa's reaction. But Richard did not like to be questioned. "Now!" The waiter hurried out to carry out the order, and a dense silence took over the restaurant. Jaden felt the weight of every expectant gaze upon him and Vanessa. The world seemed to move in slow motion as he watched the woman's movements. She was losing control, and it was making her radiate tension. Her face, once serene and confident, now showed subtle signs of panic. Her leg trembled slightly under the table, and her fingers were tightly clenching the white napkin's fabric. Richard didn't take his eyes off her for a second. He noticed every detail, every little signal. He hadn't reached his position by luck. He could detect a lie, a bluff, a well-executed scheme. And in that moment, the woman with whom he had shared his life for years now appeared merely as an adversary, on the verge of being exposed. When the waiter returned, carrying a steaming bowl identical to the one on the table, the tension intensified even further. Richard pointed to the new bowl and then to the original. "Swap them." The waiter, confused, hesitated for an instant, but obeyed. Now the soup in front of Vanessa was completely new, harmless. Richard then made a simple yet definitive gesture. He pushed the poisoned bowl toward her. "Drink." Vanessa's eyes widened, and the air around her seemed to grow heavier. For the first time, everyone in the restaurant could see her mask disintegrating. There was no more room for disguises or maneuvers. If there really was nothing wrong with the soup, she could taste it without hesitation. But she did not. Her eyes darted frantically, searching for an argument, an escape, anything that could turn the situation in her favor. "This is ridiculous, Richard. Do you really want to humiliate me in front of everyone? After everything we've been through together?" Her voice trembled, and the indignation she tried to convey sounded forced, desperate. Richard said nothing. He only continued to look at her, impassively, as he drummed his fingers on the table. His silence said more than any accusation. Vanessa realized she had no way out. The pressure increased by the second. Her gaze quickly swept the restaurant, as if searching for an ally, someone to support her, a chance to reverse the situation. But there was no one. The restaurant's patrons, who moments ago were distracted by their own lunches and idle conversations, were now completely riveted by the scene. Jaden realized that some were murmuring among themselves, exchanging knowing looks. There was no longer any way for Vanessa to manipulate things in her favor. She took a deep breath, trying to regain her air of superiority. "Have you all lost your minds?" she said, casting a scornful look at Richard. "This is nothing more than a ridiculous trap. You really think I would do something like that? For what? Money? That's offensive, Richard." But her voice failed to convey the conviction it once had. Every word came out weaker, more desperate. Richard calmly stood, straightening his jacket as if preparing for a decisive negotiation. He observed his wife for a few seconds, then sighed, shaking his head. "You always thought I was naive, didn't you?" he said, in a tone that mixed coldness and fatigue. "You thought you could hide your little betrayals, that I would never notice the glances you exchanged with those young investors who frequented our parties. You thought I was just an old pathetic man who paid for your whims." Vanessa's eyes widened, and she opened her mouth to respond, but Richard raised a hand. "But I could live with that. I could ignore your lies. I could even turn a blind eye to your games. But trying to kill me, that's another story." His voice was firm, devoid of any apparent emotion. But there was something there. A contained pain, the weight of betrayal in every word. Vanessa took a step back, now completely cornered. She knew she was trapped. "That isn't true," she murmured, but the fear in her voice betrayed her. It was then that the restaurant door swung open abruptly, and two police officers entered. The sound of their boots echoed in the absolute silence. One of the officers, a man with a severe expression and an analytical gaze, scanned the scene before stopping at Vanessa. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, his voice carrying an unquestionable authority, "we need you to come with us for questioning." The entire restaurant held its breath. The moment everyone had been waiting for had finally arrived. Vanessa froze. Her eyes widened, and for a moment it seemed she didn't understand what she had just heard. But then, something inside her broke. The veneer of control that had maintained her poise crumbled completely. Her breathing quickened, her face flushed with anger, and her fingers clenched into fists so tight that her knuckles turned white. "This is absurd," she shouted, her voice laden with desperation. "Richard, are you really going to let them treat me like this?" Her wild gaze bounced between her husband and the officers, searching for an escape, a chance to turn the tables once again. But there were no more moves, no more cards hidden up her sleeve. Richard remained impassive, and the officers showed no intention of being swayed by her shouts. One of the officers, a tall man with hard, impassive features, stepped forward and removed a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Mrs. Calloway, we ask that you come with us voluntarily. If you refuse, we will be forced to detain you." Vanessa's eyes met Richard's one last time, and in that instant, something shifted. She realized there was nowhere left to run. The man she had manipulated for years, whom she thought she controlled, now looked at her with nothing but coldness. There were no more pleas to be made, no more lies that could save her. Her face contorted in pure hatred. "You should have died a long time ago," she spat, her voice poisoned with rancor. The entire restaurant exhaled in shock as the confession escaped her lips. The officer wasted no time. He turned Vanessa around and snapped the handcuffs onto her wrists with a sharp click. "Is this a confession, Mrs. Calloway?" he asked calmly, as the woman struggled against her restraints. But it was too late. The words had already been said. As the officers escorted her out, her anger boiled over. "You will all regret this," she shouted, struggling to break free. "This isn't over, Richard. You owe me everything, and that brat—" Her eyes turned to Jaden, and for an instant he felt a shiver run down his spine. "You'll pay for this, kid." The officers pulled her along more forcefully, silencing her shouts as they led her out of the restaurant. And then, finally, silence reclaimed the space. For a long moment, no one moved. Richard, still seated, ran a hand over his face, as if finally feeling the weight of everything that had happened. The restaurant, which until minutes ago had been filled with whispers and curious glances, now seemed paralyzed, as if everyone were trying to process what they had just witnessed. And Jaden felt his heart slowly decelerate as he tried to understand what it all meant. He had just prevented a murder. He had saved a man from death. But above all, he had learned something about courage. That truth, however difficult it might be to speak, would always find its way. The weight of the moment still hung over the restaurant. Some customers murmured among themselves, exchanging incredulous looks, while others remained silent, as if afraid to break the charged tension in the air. Jaden took a deep breath, still feeling the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had never been in a situation like that, never been the center of attention in such an intense way, and certainly never confronted someone as dangerous as Vanessa Calloway. Richard, still seated at the table, kept his gaze fixed on the spot where his wife, his ex-wife he supposed, had disappeared along with the officers. The confusion and sadness were etched on his features, but above all, there was a silent acceptance. He knew that day would come. Perhaps not in this way, perhaps not with some random kid screaming in the middle of a restaurant, but somehow he always knew that Vanessa wasn't who she claimed to be. She just didn't want to admit it. Finally, he lifted his eyes to Jaden. The boy stood there, looking a bit awkward, as if still unsure whether he should simply leave or wait for someone to say something. Richard sighed and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Boy," he began, pausing for a moment as if searching for the right words. He studied the boy for an instant, absorbing the intensity in his gaze, the determination that few possessed, especially not someone so young. "You just saved my life." Jaden swallowed hard. He knew that, of course. But hearing those words spoken with such certainty and gratitude made the reality of what had just happened finally hit him. He had saved a billionaire from being poisoned by his own wife. How did that even make sense? Before he could answer, the restaurant manager cleared his throat, calling everyone's attention. He looked out of place, as if unsure how to act in that surreal situation. "Mr. Calloway, if you need anything at all," he said, choosing his words carefully. Richard just shook his head, dismissing any formality. "I'm fine." The silence lingered for a few more seconds until Richard finally stood. He straightened his jacket, as if trying to recover some semblance of dignity after what had just transpired. Then he looked at Jaden once more. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated for a moment, then answered, "Jaden. Jaden Carter." Richard slowly nodded, repeating the name in his mind. Then he looked around, noticing the fixed stares on them. A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Let's get out of here." Not fully understanding what that meant, Jaden simply nodded and followed him out of the restaurant. The world outside seemed to continue as normal, cars passing by, people hurrying along the sidewalks, completely oblivious to what had just happened inside the Park Avenue Cafe. But for Jaden, nothing felt the same. Something inside him had changed forever. The fresh air of the street hit Jaden's face as he and Richard stepped out. The murmur of conversations in the cafe had been replaced by the constant noise of the city, honking horns, hurried footsteps, the distant sound of a saxophonist playing on a corner. But for Jaden, everything seemed muted, as if the world had not yet returned to normal after what had happened. Richard stopped on the sidewalk, looking at the traffic, though his mind was far away. The silence between them stretched for a few seconds until he let out a deep sigh and finally spoke. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Jaden shrugged, still trying to comprehend it all. "I just did what I thought was right." The billionaire let out a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah, but what's right isn't always the easiest. Most people would have kept quiet." He turned to the boy, studying him once again. "And you just walked in there and prevented me from dying without a second thought." Jaden looked away, feeling the weight of those words. He had never stopped to think of it that way. His father had always taught him that doing what was right wasn't a matter of choice, but of principle. But now, standing there, he realized that he could have stayed silent, that he could have gone on with his life without getting involved, but he didn't. He never would. Richard seemed to sense his thoughts and nodded to himself. "Your father must be an incredible man." Jaden offered a small smile. "He is." Richard looked at the boy with an expression Jaden couldn't quite decipher. It was as if he was seeing something he himself had lost over the years, a purity, a courage that couldn't be bought with money. After a moment, Richard gestured toward the corner. "Come with me." Jaden hesitated. "Where to?" "I want to show you something." The boy glanced at his watch. The bus he was supposed to catch must have long since passed, and his mother was probably wondering where he had been. But something inside him said that this moment was important, that he needed to hear what Richard had to say. So, without any further questions, he followed the man down the block. They walked in silence for a few minutes until Richard stopped in front of an imposing building. It was a modern skyscraper, its glass facade reflecting the afternoon sun. At the top, golden letters shone, Calloway Tower. "This is my empire," Richard said, looking at the building. "I've spent my entire life building this. I used to think that power and money were the most important things in the world." He turned to Jaden. "But today, a 14-year-old boy taught me that courage is worth more than any fortune." Jaden looked up, taking in the grandeur of Calloway Tower. The mirrored windows reflected the city in tiny fragments, and the building seemed to stretch infinitely toward the sky. He had never been so close to something so monumental. To him, Skyscrapers like that belong to a completely different world, a world of million-dollar meetings, of suited individuals discussing figures he couldn't even imagine. Yet here he was, standing beside the man who owned all of that. And for the first time, he realized that wealth didn't equate to security. Not even someone like Richard Calloway was immune to betrayal and dangers hidden beneath carefully rehearsed smiles. Richard took a deep breath before continuing. "I always thought money bought everything." He looked at the tower as if it contained every decision of his life, good and bad. And in a way, it does buy things: comfort, power, even influence. Then he turned his face toward Jaden, his eyes carrying a weight the boy had never seen before. "But you know what it can't buy? Integrity." Jaden frowned, absorbing those words. It wasn't the first time he'd heard something like that. His father used to say similar things. But hearing it from a man who had spent his life accumulating wealth made it all the more real. Richard sighed and pointed toward the building's entrance. "Come with me. I want to show you something." Not knowing exactly what to expect, Jaden followed him through the lobby of Calloway Tower. The interior was even more impressive than the exterior: polished marble floors, modern chandeliers, impeccably dressed receptionists, and a subtle scent of expensive coffee and new paper in the air. They crossed the lobby and took the elevator. Richard pressed the button for the top floor, and the doors closed with a light metallic sound. The silence in the elevator was broken only by the hum of its ascent. Jaden felt a slight pressure from the movement and noticed his hands were sweaty. He wasn't sure why. When the doors opened, he was greeted by a view that took his breath away. Richard's office occupied the entire top of the building. The space was expansive, luxurious, yet not ostentatious. It was elegant, measured. In the center stood a huge dark wood table, and behind it an entire wall of glass, offering a spectacular view of the city. Richard walked to the window and stood silently for a moment, watching the miniature cars and people that looked like ants down below. Then, without turning around, he said, "You know what money can't buy, Jaden?" The boy stepped further into the office, feeling the weight of that question. "What?" Richard turned, his expression that of someone who finally saw what had been right in front of him all along. People who do the right thing, even when they gain nothing from it. Jaden fell silent, absorbing Richard's words. He looked at the man before him, a man who at first glance seemed to have everything the world could offer: wealth, power, respect. But now it seemed Richard had reached a conclusion that Jaden was only beginning to understand. Perhaps all that he had achieved, all the victories and defeats, meant nothing without truth, without the simple act of doing what was right. "I always wanted to have control over everything," Richard continued, his gaze lost in the vastness of the city ahead. "But the truth is, the world doesn't work like that. No one has complete control, and sometimes what you think is yours can be snatched away in the blink of an eye." He paused, as if the memory of his own vulnerability still troubled him. "I didn't know what to do with that until now." Jaden took a step forward, a bit confused. "With what?" Richard turned, his eyes now fixed on the boy with a different glimmer, not of authority or detachment, but of someone who had transformed. "With the fact that what really matters isn't what you have, but who you are." He offered a small smile, that though slight, seemed sincere. "And you, Jaden, you've shown me that courage and honesty are worth more than any glass building or bank account." A silence stretched between them, but it was no longer an uncomfortable one. It was a silence that somehow united them in a mutual understanding. Jaden still couldn't fully grasp the impact his actions had on Richard's life, but something inside him knew that in some way he had just changed the course of that man's history, and perhaps by extension, changed his own. Then Richard moved to an elegant glass table where a stack of papers lay. He pushed them aside and pulled out an envelope. "This is for you." Jaden looked at the envelope, surprised. "What's this?" Richard placed the envelope in front of Jaden. "An opportunity, something you could never achieve with just a day's work." He smiled once again, a genuine smile this time. I know you didn't do what you did expecting a reward, but you deserve more. You deserve to be seen. Jaden hesitated before taking the envelope. He knew this could be something big, but what truly moved him was what Richard was trying to convey. He was offering more than a financial or material reward. He was offering a chance to change his life, to have access to a world he had never imagined. I don't know what to say, Jaden began, feeling the weight of the envelope in his hands. I just did what I thought was right. And that's why you're here, Richard completed, looking directly at him. You did the right thing, even when there was nothing to gain from it. That, Jaden, is what the world needs now, more than ever. Jaden held the envelope for a moment, feeling the symbolic weight of what he was about to discover. He looked at Richard, trying to figure out if this was some kind of test, a twist of fate to see if he'd accept an unexpected gift. His heart pounded. He had always lived in a world where opportunities like this simply didn't appear. With slightly sweaty hands, he opened the envelope and slid out a thick sheet of paper. His eyes quickly scanned the content, and his breath caught for a moment. At the top of the page, one name leapt out, St. James Academy. He frowned, confused. This is, Richard smiled, folding his arms. A full scholarship to the best school in town. Jaden blinked, trying to process the information. His brain seemed to fight against the reality of the situation. But why? Richard sighed and leaned on the table. Because I believe the world needs more people like you. You didn't hesitate, you didn't cower, you didn't think about what you might gain or lose. You simply did what was right. He pointed to the paper. And this is just the beginning. The boy fell silent. His heart pounded like a drum in his chest. Never in his life had he imagined studying at an elite school. He knew schools like St. James Academy were for the children of the elite, children of people like Richard Calloway, not for kids like him, who took crowded buses to public school and wore worn-out sneakers until the soles began to peel. He looked at Richard, trying to find a reason to refuse. I don't know if I belong there. Richard let out a short laugh, not mocking, but as if he recognized that kind of thought. I used to think I didn't belong in that world when I started in real estate, but the truth is, no one belongs anywhere until they decide to claim their space. He leaned in slightly, his gaze fixed on Jaden's. You belong wherever you want to be. Jaden gripped the paper between his fingers, feeling a mix of fear and excitement. A new door was opening before him, but crossing it meant entering an entirely unfamiliar world. He knew it would be challenging. He knew that many students at that school would see him as an outsider, but at the same time, he knew this opportunity was unique. He swallowed hard and looked back at Richard. What if I fail? The billionaire shrugged and smiled. Then you get up and try again. Jaden stared at the document in his hands, feeling the weight of the decision unfolding before him. The idea of studying at St. James Academy seemed surreal. He pictured luxurious corridors, students in impeccable uniforms, the children of magnates and politicians discussing international investments and business deals. Meanwhile, he was just an ordinary kid, raised under his father's military discipline and used to facing challenges from a completely different reality. Don't decide now, Richard said, noticing the boy's hesitation. But I want you to know that this door is open for you. You've proven that you have something many of these rich kids will never have. Jaden looked up at him. What? Character. The word echoed in Jaden's mind. He had never thought of it that way. He never saw himself as someone special, just a kid trying to do the right thing the way his father taught him. But somehow, that had been enough to change the life of a man like Richard Calloway. He took a deep breath and tucked the document into his backpack. I'll think about it. Richard nodded. That's all I ask. Then the billionaire glanced at his wristwatch and sighed. I think you must be late getting home. Your mother will want to know where you've been. Jaden's eyes widened. Damn! I didn't even notice the time passing. He grabbed his backpack quickly and prepared to leave, but paused before taking the first step. Thank you, Mr. Calloway. For everything. Richard smiled and extended his hand. Call me Richard. The boy shook his hand, feeling a strange sense of mutual respect. With one last nod, he left the office and took the elevator. As it descended, his heart still raced and his mind buzzed with all the possibilities that conversation had opened. When he finally exited the building, the world outside looked the same. The traffic, the hurried people, the background sounds of the city. But Jaden knew that something inside him had changed. He was no longer just a kid who witnessed a crime and prevented a murder. He was someone with a different future ahead. As he walked to the bus stop, he looked at his backpack and felt the weight of the paper inside. St. James Academy. He didn't know if he was ready for it. But somehow, he felt that this story was only just beginning. The journey home never seemed so long. Jaden replayed every detail of that day in his mind, from the moment he saw Vanessa pouring the liquid into the soup to the furious confession that led to her being handcuffed. He still felt the adrenaline coursing through his body as if he were reliving it all. But now, with a calmer head, he realized something new. For the first time, he felt that he had changed something in the world. He caught the bus, sitting by the window, watching the city flash by. Ordinary people coming and going, with no idea of what he had just experienced. A billionaire was nearly assassinated, a woman was arrested, and he was there, returning home as if it were just another normal day. But it wasn't. Nothing would ever be normal again. When he finally arrived home, his mother was already waiting in the living room, arms crossed, and an expression that mixed relief with irritation. "Jaden Carter, where have you been? I called the school, and no one could tell me where you had gone." He swallowed hard. "Mom, I can explain." She raised an eyebrow. "I hope so." Jaden took his backpack off his shoulders and threw it onto the couch. "Something big happened." She narrowed her eyes, studying him for a moment. "What kind of big?" He took a deep breath. "I kind of saved a billionaire today." The silence in the room was almost comical. His mother's expression wavered between disbelief and exasperation. "Jaden, if this is some lame excuse to justify your lateness..." "It's not." He quickly pulled out the St. James Academy paper from his backpack and handed it to her. "Look at this." She took the document and began to read. As her eyes scanned the lines, her expression changed from irritation to confusion, then to sheer shock. This is a scholarship for the best school in town," Jaden added, sitting down on the couch. "Richard Calloway offered it to me after what happened today." His mother looked at him, still trying to process. "Wait, Richard Calloway? The real estate magnate who's in every newspaper?" Jaden nodded. "Yes, that's him." She set the paper on her lap and ran her hand over her face, trying to understand how this was possible. "Son, what exactly happened today?" He knew he'd have to tell everything. He knew the story would sound unbelievable. But as he saw the look of concern and pride in his mother's eyes, he realized that for the first time he was on a path that could change everything. Jaden took a deep breath before beginning to recount everything. His mother listened intently, without interrupting, but he could see disbelief growing in her eyes with each detail. When he described the moment when Vanessa poured the liquid into the soup, she widened her eyes. When he recounted how he interrupted the lunch with his shouts, she covered her mouth. And when he mentioned the arrival of the police and Vanessa's confession, she simply shook her head, stunned. "My God, Jaden, do you have any idea of the danger you were in?" she finally said, her voice laden with worry. He shrugged. "I didn't think about it at the time. I just knew I had to do something." She closed her eyes for a moment and sighed, as if trying to find the right words. "Son, I raised you to be an honest, brave man. But you can't just go around getting into dangerous situations like that. This isn't a game." Jaden nodded slowly. He knew she was right, but at the same time, he couldn't regret what he did. If he had stayed silent, Richard Calloway would be dead by now. "I know, Mom. But what if it were the other way around? What if I hadn't done anything? How could I live with myself knowing I let something like that happen?" His mother stared at him for a long moment, then shook her head with a half-smile. "You definitely got it from your father." The mention of his father made Jaden smile. Colonel Marcus Carter had always taught him that honor was above all. He knew that if his father were there, he'd probably scold him for putting himself at risk, but deep down, he'd be proud. Jaden's mother picked up the St. James Academy document again and reread the first few lines. "Is this real?" she asked, looking at him skeptically. "Absolutely real," he replied. "Richard said he wanted to give me this opportunity because the world needs more people who do the right thing." She fell silent, thinking. "And you want that?" Jaden hesitated. He still didn't have a definitive answer. St. James Academy was a completely different place from what he knew. There, he wouldn't just be an ordinary student, he'd be the scholarship kid, the odd one out in a world of privileges. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think I have to try." His mother studied his face for a moment, searching for something in his expression. Then, gently, she placed her hand on his. "If that's your decision, then I'll support you." Jaden exhaled in relief. He didn't know what to expect from this new phase, but at least he knew he wouldn't be alone. The following days passed in a blur for Jaden. With each new morning, the idea of studying at St. James Academy felt less like a distant dream and more like an inevitable reality. He spent hours researching the school, watching videos on its official website, looking at images of the immaculate corridors, huge auditoriums, and classrooms that resembled advanced technology labs. Everything seemed so different from what he was used to that a knot formed in his stomach every time he thought about the possibility of really being there. But what worried him most wasn't the size of the campus or the renowned teachers. It was the kind of people who studied there, the children of politicians, heirs to fortunes, kids who grew up surrounded by privileges he never had. How would they look at him? How would they treat someone who got in not through money, but because he prevented a murder? On the night before his first day, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the folded uniform in front of him. His mother came in and watched him for a moment before speaking. "You're nervous." Jaden sighed. "I don't know what to expect." She pulled out a chair and sat beside him. "Son, you've always been smart and strong. No matter where you are, you'll find your way." He looked at her, feeling the weight of the moment. "But what if I don't belong there? What if they make me feel like I'm just an outsider?" His mother smiled gently. "Then prove them wrong." Jaden took a deep breath. He wanted to believe it. He wanted to believe that he could enter that world without being crushed by the weight of expectations and judgments. But there was only one way to find out. The next morning, he found himself before the enormous gates of St. James Academy. The main building rose like a modern castle, imposing and steeped in history. Luxurious cars passed by, dropping off students who looked like they had stepped out of a fashion magazine. Some laughed together, while others walked straight past, oblivious to the presence of the worn backpack kid watching them. "Here goes," he murmured to himself. He adjusted his backpack strap, took a deep breath, and walked through the gates, ready to face the unknown. As soon as Jaden crossed the gates of St. James Academy, he immediately felt he was stepping into a different territory. The campus was immaculate, with well-tended gardens and majestic buildings that exuded tradition and exclusivity. He watched groups of students scattered around the courtyard, some animatedly chatting, others absorbed in their ultra-thin cell phones or laptops. Each one seemed to belong in that place in a way that Jaden couldn't fake. He walked along the stone path to the main entrance, gripping his backpack tightly as if that could prevent anyone from noticing that he didn't quite fit in. The looks from the other students weren't exactly hostile, but there was something in them. A cool curiosity, as if they were trying to figure out who this new kid was who dared to step into their territory. At the reception, a woman with thin glasses and a stern expression looked at him with professional formality. Name? Jaden Carter. She typed something into the computer and within seconds handed him a temporary badge and an envelope with his class schedule. Your locker is number 318, East Wing. Your first period is history. Welcome to St. James Academy." He took the papers and thanked her, trying to ignore the appraising look she gave his outfit. Ordinary jeans and a sweatshirt that clearly didn't match the school standard. Great start, he thought, rolling his eyes internally. Following the instructions, he walked down the main corridor where rows of gleaming metal lockers were perfectly aligned. He found locker number 318, and while turning the combination dial, he heard a group of students laughing behind him. "So, you're the scholarship kid, huh?" Jaden slowly turned around and came face to face with three boys dressed in the school uniform impeccably. In the center, a blonde kid with a confident look and a smirk scrutinized him from head to toe. "Let me guess," the blonde continued. "You're the kid who made the news because you stopped Calloway's wife from killing him, right?" Jaden maintained a neutral expression. "So what?" The blonde laughed. "Nothing. I just think it's funny how some people can get in here without having to do anything other than be in the right place at the right time." Jaden's jaw clenched. He already knew he would face this kind of thing, but he hadn't expected it so soon. Another boy in the group, a tall, lean brunette, stepped forward. "Relax, Colin. Maybe he's smart. Or maybe he's just lucky enough to think a heroic act buys him a pass here." Jaden folded his arms. "If I'm here, it's because I deserve it." Colin raised an eyebrow and gave a crooked smile. "We'll see about that." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away with the other two, leaving Jaden with an uneasy feeling in his stomach. He closed his locker and took a deep breath. It was only the first day, and he already knew he'd have to fight to prove his worth. Jaden slammed his locker door with a slight bang and forced himself to breathe deeply. He had expected that his presence at St. James Academy wouldn't go unnoticed, but he hadn't imagined the hostility would start so soon. He could handle strange looks and whispers, but being openly belittled on the very first day made his blood boil. Still, he couldn't afford to lose his temper. His father always said that the best way to win a battle was to stay calm and observe your enemy before acting. "Keep your head up, kid," he remembered Colonel Carter's words. "They can only bring you down if you let them." With that thought in mind, he slung his backpack over one shoulder and headed to his first class. The corridor seemed longer than it needed to be, each step echoing on the polished floor. When he finally found the history classroom, he paused at the door and looked inside. The class was nearly full. Most of the students were chatting among themselves, taking their seats as if they'd been there for years. There was an air of confidence in all of them, a certainty that they belonged in that space, that the place was made for them. Jaden, on the other hand, felt like the only misfit in the equation. He made his way to a seat at the back of the room, avoiding eye contact with the already seated students. But just as he was about to sit down, an energetic voice interrupted him. "Hey, you're Jaden, right?" He turned and saw a girl with brown skin and curly hair tied in a ponytail. She had bright eyes and a genuine smile, something rare in that environment where everyone seemed to wear calculated expressions. "Yes, I am," he replied, a bit guarded. She extended her hand. "I'm Ava. I'm new here too." Jaden shook her hand and felt a slight relief at not being the only newcomer. "New like me or new like my family just donated a building to the school?" he teased, half joking, half serious. Ava laughed. "Definitely not that. We didn't donate any building." Jaden let out a short laugh, relaxing a little. Finally, someone who didn't look at him as if he were an outsider. "Well, if it helps, I already made my first enemy," he commented, discreetly pointing toward Colin, who was a few rows ahead chatting with a group of boys who looked as arrogant as he was. Ava followed his gaze and rolled her eyes. "Ah, Colin Montgomery. Of course, he's already found a way to hassle you. He's a classic school prince, rich, spoiled, and used to always getting his way." Jaden nodded. "Great. Then he's definitely going to hate me." Ava gave him a side smile. "If it makes you feel any better, I'm not his biggest fan either." Jaden looked at her for a moment and realized something. Maybe Even in that hostile environment, he wasn't as alone as he thought. Soon after, the teacher entered the room, ending the chatter with a simple glance. He was a tall, lean man with neatly cut grey hair and a jacket that seemed far too expensive for a teacher. His gaze was piercing, as if he could see the students' thoughts before they even spoke. "Good morning, class," he said in a firm, unhurried voice. "I'm Professor Harding. This history course won't be just about dates and events. Here you will learn to interpret the past and understand how it shapes the present." Jaden straightened up. If there was one subject he liked, it was history. His father always said that those who understood the past would never be surprised by the future. He glanced to the side and saw that Ava seemed equally interested, unlike many other students who merely pretended to pay attention. Professor Harding walked slowly over to his desk and picked up a small leather-bound book. He held it up for the class. "Has anyone here heard of The Prince by Machiavelli?" Several hands went up, including Colin Montgomery's, who answered without hesitation. "It's a book about power and strategy. Machiavelli argued that the best way to rule was to be feared rather than loved." The professor nodded. "That's what most people know. But the real question is, to what extent does power justify a leader's actions? Is there room for morality in the game of power?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Jaden felt a shiver run down his spine. That was exactly the kind of dilemma he had faced on the day of the incident at the restaurant. Vanessa Calloway had acted driven by power and greed, with no regard for morality. Richard, on the other hand, had realized too late that power without character meant nothing. The silence was broken when Colin turned slightly around and shot a direct look at Jaden. "I think the best person to answer that question is our new scholarship kid. After all, he's already experienced what it's like to mess with powerful people." The entire room turned to Jaden. A wave of heat flushed his face, but he did not look away. He knew what Colin was trying to do: challenge his presence, make him feel out of place. But if there was one thing Jaden had learned in recent days, it was that he couldn't let himself be intimidated. "It depends," he said, his voice steady. "If a leader has to choose between being feared or loved, maybe they've already failed. True power doesn't come from fear. It comes from respect." The room fell silent for a few seconds. Professor Harding looked at Jaden intently before giving a slight smile. "An interesting answer. Let's explore that further." Colin frowned, clearly irritated that Jaden hadn't backed down. Jaden, on the other hand, felt he had just marked his territory. He was still an outsider in that world, but now he knew that if they tried to bring him down, he'd be ready to fight back. The class continued at an intense pace, and Jaden noticed that Professor Harding wasn't the type to give ready-made answers. He asked sharp questions, sparked debates, and challenged the students to think beyond the obvious. That was something Jaden appreciated. He liked being intellectually challenged, seeing different perspectives on a subject. Yet, at the same time, he couldn't ignore the fact that some students looked at him differently after his answer to Colin. Some seemed intrigued, as if they hadn't expected a scholarship kid to have anything relevant to say. Others, like Colin, appeared simply irritated. But there were also those who didn't seem to care, like Ava, who gave him a discreet smile before returning to her notes. When class ended, the students began to disperse, gathering their belongings and heading to their next class. Jaden put his notebook into his backpack when he heard a voice behind him. "Good answer in there." He turned and saw a tall boy with neatly cut brown hair and an impeccable posture. His uniform was perfectly in order, and he carried an air of seriousness that contrasted with his casual tone. "Thanks," Jaden replied, unsure of what to expect. The boy extended his hand. "I'm Liam Astor. My father is one of the school board directors." Jaden shook his hand firmly. "Jaden Carter." Liam tilted his head slightly, as if examining Jaden more closely. "I've known Colin since we were kids. He might be an idiot, but he isn't dumb. If he's trying to unsettle you on the first day, it's because he thinks you might be a threat." Jaden raised an eyebrow. "A threat?" Liam shrugged. Someone who doesn't fit the school's mold, but somehow manages to stand out. That bothers people like him. Jaden pondered Liam's words. It made sense. Colin didn't seem like the type to handle change well, let alone the presence of someone who didn't see the world the same way. Before he could respond, Ava appeared next to them, crossing her arms. "Liam, are you trying to recruit Jaden for your future American CEO team?" Liam laughed lightly. "I'd say I'm just trying to keep him from being swallowed up by Colin before he even begins." Ava looked at Jaden. "Well, I think he's already proven he can hold his own." Jaden smiled faintly. "I try." Liam nodded. "Anyway, if you need anything, let me know. I don't usually get involved in these school status games, but I don't like seeing injustice either." He gave a slight nod and walked away, leaving Jaden and Ava in the hallway. "Interesting," Ava commented. "Liam usually doesn't get involved with anyone outside his circle. Looks like you're already making an impact here." Jaden laughed softly, shaking his head. "And I haven't even done anything yet." "Exactly," Ava said, smiling. "And that's what's making some people nervous." The day continued at an intense pace, and Jaden quickly realized that St. James Academy was more than just a school for the rich. The classes were challenging, the teachers demanded a lot from the students, and there was a constant competition in the air. Every test, every presentation, every answer in class seemed like an opportunity for someone to stand out or to be left behind. During the break, Jaden and Ava decided to explore the campus. The school was even larger than he had imagined, with historic buildings connected by modern corridors, pristine sports courts, and a cafeteria that resembled a sophisticated restaurant. He observed students clustering in small groups, as if each already knew exactly where they belonged. "It's like a well-organized zoo," Jaden murmured, watching a group of girls laughing at a table while a group of well-dressed boys discussed something seriously at another. Ava laughed. "Welcome to the world of St. James. Here it's all about status, who you know, where you come from, what your parents do. This place is a bubble, and everyone here is trying to prove they deserve to be inside it." Jaden looked around. "And where do we fit in?" She smiled wryly. "We don't, which can be good or bad, depending on how you see it." Before Jaden could respond, a group approached. At the center was Colin Montgomery, as usual, surrounded by two boys who looked ready to back up any provocation he was about to launch. "So, scholarship kid," Colin began, folding his arms. "How do you like the school for the rich?" Jaden maintained his relaxed posture. "I haven't decided yet, but so far it seems like some people here care more about my presence than I do." The boys next to Colin laughed, but he maintained a stern expression. "You think you have a chance to fit in here? That you'll be one of us?" Jaden took a deep breath. "I'm not trying to be one of you. I'm here because I earned this opportunity. If that bothers you, then maybe you're the problem, not me." There was a moment of silence. Then Ava let out a short laugh. "You should write that down, Colin. It might come in handy when someone reminds you that the real world doesn't revolve around you." Colin narrowed his eyes, clearly irritated. "Enjoy it while you can, Carter. This place isn't for just anyone. You'll see." He walked away with his followers, but Jaden knew that this wouldn't be the last time he'd have to deal with him. Ava stepped forward, smiling wryly. "You're definitely already a target." Jaden sighed, but smiled back. "Great. Now I just have to prove them wrong." The afternoon passed with more classes, each more challenging than the last. Jaden realized quickly that he couldn't just blend in at St. James Academy. The school wasn't just a space for millionaires' children. It was a battleground where every student tried to stand out, whether academically, socially, or through powerful connections. In advanced mathematics class, the teacher, a stern-looking man with thin glasses, announced a group activity. Jaden felt a wave of apprehension. He knew most students already had their social circles well defined, and finding a group could be challenging. He looked around, and the reaction was almost immediate. Some students quickly averted their eyes, pretending to be busy. Others whispered among themselves, clearly avoiding getting near the new kid scholarship. Only Ava smiled at him and pulled out a chair next to him. Before they could start, Liam Astor appeared, casually tossing his backpack onto the table next to them. "I hope you don't mind," he said casually. "The last thing I want is to end up in Colin's group." Jaden exchanged a look with Ava, who seemed as surprised as he was. "So you chose the side of the outcasts?" she teased. Liam smiled slightly. "I'd prefer to call it the side of smart people." Jaden let out a short laugh. For the first time that day, he felt he wasn't alone. The activity began, and Jaden realized that Liam really knew what he was doing. He explained the problems with ease, as if math were his second language. Ava also grasped the concepts quickly, making the work more efficient than Jaden had expected. However, it wasn't long before the calm was disrupted. "Looks like our scholarship kid found some protection," Colin's voice echoed from the other side of the room. He was seated with two of his friends, watching Jaden's group with a sarcastic smile. "Liam, I didn't know you liked charity." Liam didn't even blink. "Colin, I didn't know you liked playing the fool in public." The room let out a few low laughs. Colin's face fell, clearly irritated, but before he could respond, the teacher clapped his hands. "Let's focus on the work, gentlemen." Colin looked away, but Jaden knew it wasn't over. When class ended, Liam turned to Jaden and Ava. "You know Colin won't let this go, right?" Jaden shrugged. "He can try all he wants. I'm not here to please him." Ava laughed. "That's the most dangerous thing you could have said." Jaden smiled, but he knew it was true. Colin Montgomery wasn't the type to take defeat gracefully, and now Jaden had become his definitive target. When the final bell rang, Jaden grabbed his backpack and headed for the exit. He was tired, but his mind was still processing everything. St. James Academy was a place very different from what he was used to, but it wasn't impossible to handle. He just needed to find his rhythm. Ava was the first to say goodbye, catching a black car with a private driver waiting outside. "See you tomorrow, scholarship kid," she joked before getting in and disappearing into traffic. Liam stayed by Jaden's side for a moment, watching as students exited through the main gate. "If you need anything, let me know," he said. "Colin might be a problem, but he isn't invincible." Jaden nodded. "Thanks, man." Liam smiled slightly before walking away, leaving Jaden alone on the sidewalk. He looked at the imposing facade of St. James Academy for a moment before heading to the bus stop. His first day had been intense, but he knew the next ones would be even more challenging. While waiting for the bus, he took his phone out of his pocket and saw a message from his mother. "How was your first day?" Jaden smiled and began typing a reply. But before he could finish, he felt a presence beside him. He turned and saw an unfamiliar boy, perhaps a year or two older, standing there. The boy had a scrutinizing look, as if he were carefully analyzing Jaden. "So you're the Carter, huh?" the boy said bluntly. Jaden frowned. "And you are," the boy smirked slightly. "Someone who thinks you might have just gotten yourself into something bigger than you imagine." Jaden tensed. "What kind of something?" The boy sighed and glanced around, making sure no one was listening. "Colin isn't just a pampered rich kid. He has connections, and he doesn't like to lose. If you're not careful, you'll find out the hard way." Jaden crossed his arms. "And why are you warning me?" The boy gave an enigmatic smile. "Let's say I've been in your shoes before, and I know how this game is played." Before Jaden could ask anything more, the bus arrived. The boy gave him one last look before starting to walk away. "See you round, Carter." Jaden boarded the bus, still processing that unexpected encounter. Who was that boy? What did he know about Colin? And more importantly, what exactly did he mean by game? As the bus pulled away, Jaden realized that his life at St. James Academy was about to get even more complicated. The bus ride home was quiet, but Jaden's mind was in turmoil. The unexpected encounter with the unknown boy left him intrigued. Who was he? How did he know so much about Colin? And what did he mean by game? Once home, his mother was waiting in the kitchen, preparing dinner. The aroma of warm food filled the air, bringing a familiar sense of comfort. Yet Jaden still felt trapped in the day's events. "So?" his mother asked as she served him a plate. "How was the first day?" He sat at the table and sighed. "Intense." She raised an eyebrow. "Is that good or bad?" Jaden shrugged. "The teachers are good. The place is amazing, but there are people who definitely don't want me here." His mother sat across from him, resting her elbows on the table. "You knew this would happen?" He nodded. "Yes, but expecting it and actually living it are two different things." She sipped her tea before continuing. "And do you want to give up?" Jaden looked down at his plate. He knew this was the most important question of the evening. He could easily say yes, abandon everything and return to his old life. But something inside him wouldn't allow that. He had never run from a challenge, and it wouldn't start now. He lifted his eyes and met his mother's. "No, I'm staying, but I know it won't be easy." She smiled gently. "Nothing worth having is easy." Jaden smiled back, though a weight still lingered in his mind. He needed to find out more about Colin and this so-called game unfolding at school. Later, while lying in bed and fiddling with his phone, he decided to search for Colin Montgomery. He typed his name into the browser and found several articles about his family. They were owners of a financial empire, with businesses ranging from real estate to international investments. But one article caught his attention. Montgomery family involved in market manipulation controversy. Jaden clicked on the article and began reading. According to the report, Colin's father, a magnate named Charles Montgomery, had already been investigated for dubious financial schemes. Nothing was proven, but the case was quickly hushed up. "So that's where he comes from," Jaden murmured to himself. If Colin had grown up in an environment where money bought silence and influence erased mistakes, it made sense that he acted as if the world revolved around him. But the question now was, how far was he willing to go to maintain that power? Jaden closed his phone and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow would be a new day, and he needed to be ready for whatever came. Because now he knew he was dealing with something much bigger than just a spoiled kid. The story continues. The next morning, Jaden woke with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew St. James Academy wouldn't be easy, but he now understood that something much larger was at stake than just tests and student rivalries. Colin Montgomery wasn't merely a rich kid who thought he was superior. He came from a family used to playing dirty to keep their status. And if Jaden wanted to survive there, he'd have to learn the rules of the game quickly. The walk to school was uneventful, but his mind raced. What did that mysterious boy mean by "Colin has connections"? What exactly did it mean to be on his radar? Jaden knew he'd have to find out on his own. As soon as he entered the gates of St. James, he sensed a change in the atmosphere. The stares lingered longer, the whispers were more evident. He could feel an odd energy in the air. Something had changed. Ava appeared beside him, holding a cup of coffee and an expression that suggested she had some information. "Did you see what they did?" Jaden frowned. "What?" She took out her phone and showed him a photo posted on an anonymous school account. In the image, a banner hung in the gymnasium read, "Scholarship students are not welcome." The caption said, "Some places aren't made for everyone. St. James Elite." Jaden's stomach dropped. He knew Colin wouldn't easily accept his presence, but this was a direct attack. "Seriously," Jaden murmured, taking the phone to read the comments. Many students were laughing, others were just riding the wave. But a few criticized the attitude. Ava sighed. "Colin is starting to show what he's capable of. He wants it to be clear that you don't belong here." Jaden clenched his fists but forced himself to breathe deeply. Exploding in anger would only give Colin exactly what he wanted. Liam appeared next to them, also holding his phone. "This is going too far." Jaden looked at him. "So what do I do now? Pretend I didn't see it?" Liam thought for a second before replying. "If you ignore it, he'll continue. If you fight back, you enter his game." Ava crossed her arms. "So the question is, what's your next move?" Jaden knew this was the most important question of the day. He could let it pass, pretend nothing happened, and try to focus on his studies. Or he could act, show that he wouldn't be easily intimidated. He took his phone, opened the school's anonymous account, and typed a simple, direct comment. The problem with weak people is that they're always afraid of those coming from below. Within less than a minute, the post exploded with notifications. The game had truly begun. Jaden knew his comment would have an impact, but he hadn't expected such a rapid response. In just minutes, the post received dozens of likes and shares, becoming the hot topic at St. James Academy. Some students commented with admiration for his boldness. Others, likely Colin's allies, reacted with sarcastic emojis or tried to diminish him with snide replies. But what caught his attention most was the private message that appeared on his phone. An unknown number read, "You just became a problem, Carter. And problems don't last long around here." He frowned and showed the screen to Ava and Liam. "Guess who?" Ava said, rolling her eyes. "Colin must be foaming with rage right now." Liam looked at the message with a serious expression. This isn't just a tease. He's warning that he'll retaliate. Jaden put his phone away in his pocket. "Then let him try?" Ava laughed. "I like your courage. But just remember, he doesn't play fair." The trio headed off to class, but the tension lingered in the air. Throughout the day, Jaden noticed more and more students watching him with curiosity, as if waiting to see what would happen next. Some even gave him small nods of support, as if they respected that he wouldn't bow to the school's status quo. But by the end of the afternoon, Jaden realized that Colin hadn't forgotten what had happened. Quite the contrary. At the end of his last class, Jaden opened his locker and was hit by a strong, sour smell. His stomach churned when he saw it was completely filthy. Someone had poured spoiled milk and rotten food inside. Books, notebooks, everything was ruined. Ava, standing nearby, immediately pinched her nose. "Ugh, how gross! Who does something like that?" Jaden didn't need to ask. He knew exactly who. Liam appeared shortly after and frowned at the sight. "Colin." Jaden clenched his fists. "This isn't going to stay like this." Liam looked at him cautiously. "What do you plan to do?" Jaden took his phone and snapped a photo of the mess. Then he exhaled deeply and said, "I'm going to show the whole school who he really is." Ava and Liam exchanged glances. Jaden wasn't going to just react. He was about to take a stand in the war that Colin had started. He held his phone for a moment, analyzing the photo of the destroyed locker. The disgusting mess wasn't just an attack, it was a message. Colin wanted it to be clear that he was in control, that he could do whatever he wanted without consequences. But Jaden wasn't the type to bow down to such intimidation. He opened the school's anonymous app and, without hesitation, posted the photo with a short, direct caption. "When you can't win an argument, you resort to dirty tricks. Is that what elite means to some around here?" The post went viral within minutes. Students began commenting, some shocked at Jaden's boldness, others mocking Colin's childish behavior. The truth was, most already knew how Colin was, but few had the courage to openly challenge him. Liam looked at Jaden and gave a small smile. "You really want to make powerful enemies, huh?" Ava crossed her arms. "And I'm loving it." But Jaden knew this wouldn't go unanswered. He hadn't expected the retaliation to come so quickly. When the trio left the school, he noticed a group of students waiting near the gate. In the center, Colin stood, hands in his pockets and a smug smile on his face. He didn't look nervous or angry. He looked entertained. "Carter, Carter," Colin called, shaking his head. "You really like to get attention, don't you?" Jaden maintained a firm posture. "I'm just showing everyone what kind of person you really are." Colin smiled, but his eyes held no humor. "Funny. Because to me, you just seem like a desperate kid trying to fit in where you don't belong." Ava stepped forward. "If he didn't belong here, he wouldn't have earned the scholarship. But for some reason, that seems to upset you a lot." Colin ignored Ava and continued to stare at Jaden. "You think a post can change anything? You think people really care?" Jaden crossed his arms. Maybe some don't, but what about you? If you didn't care, you wouldn't be here now. For a moment, Colin's smile disappeared. Then he turned to his friends and let out a dry laugh. He's smart, but let's see how long this lasts. With that, he walked away, his friends trailing behind him. But Jaden knew this wasn't the end. It was only a warning. Ava sighed theatrically. Well, now you're definitely on his blacklist. Liam nodded. And if I were you, I'd be careful. Colin doesn't lose and walk away. Jaden clenched his fists. He already knew that. But Colin had no idea who he was dealing with. In the following days, Jaden noticed that his post hadn't just exposed Colin. It had caused a real rift at St. James Academy. Some students began openly talking about how Colin always got away with everything. Others continued to follow him blindly, defending him and trying to downplay what had happened. But what really caught Jaden's attention was that, for the first time, Colin seemed to be questioned. In the cafeteria, as he grabbed his lunch, he overheard whispers everywhere. "Did you see that post? Finally, someone had the guts to stand up to Montgomery. Do you think the principal will do something about it this time? Colin is furious. They say he's planning something big." Jaden pretended not to listen, but he knew it was a clear sign that things were changing. He didn't want to be seen as a vigilante or someone stirring up trouble, but if his presence meant that people began questioning who truly held power at the school, then it was worth it. Ava and Liam joined him at the table, and she was the first to speak. "Do you realize the chaos you've caused?" Jaden gave a half smile. "I just showed the truth." Liam crossed his arms. "And by doing that, you've become an inadvertent symbol of resistance." Before they could continue, a microphone sound echoed through the cafeteria. Everyone turned to see Colin Montgomery standing on one of the tables, holding a microphone as if he were hosting a show. "Good morning, my dear classmates," he began with a calculated smile. "It looks like we have a new star at our school, the famous Jaden Carter, the heroic revolutionary scholarship kid." The crowd murmured, and Jaden felt dozens of eyes on him. He kept a neutral expression, waiting to see where Colin was going with this. "I was thinking," Colin continued, "if Jaden wants to prove himself so badly, maybe we should give him a real chance to show what he's got." Jaden narrowed his eyes. "What's your plan, Montgomery?" Colin smiled even wider. "A little competition, an exclusive event at St. James, reserved only for those who truly want to prove their worth. And I think you should participate." Ava and Liam exchanged worried glances. "That sounds like a trap," Ava whispered. But Jaden knew he couldn't back down now, not after everything. He stood and crossed his arms. "What kind of competition?" Colin grinned more broadly. "A test of intelligence, strategy, and endurance." The entire cafeteria fell silent. Something told Jaden he was about to step into something much bigger than he had imagined. The room waited for Jaden's response. Colin stood there, on the table, smiling as if he had already won. He wanted to provoke, to make Jaden hesitate, to show any sign of weakness. But Jaden knew he couldn't give him that satisfaction. "What if I refuse?" Jaden asked, crossing his arms. Colin let out a short laugh. "Well, then everyone will have the confirmation of what they already suspected, that you may talk a lot, but when it comes to action, you lack the courage." The silence in the room grew even heavier. Jaden felt Ava and Liam tense beside him. Colin wasn't just issuing a challenge, he was setting a trap. Jaden let out a short sigh and forced a small smile. "All right, Montgomery, I'm in." The crowd murmured and Colin raised an eyebrow as if satisfied. "Great. See you tomorrow night at the abandoned warehouse behind the gym." Jaden narrowed his eyes. "At the warehouse? Is that part of your big plan?" Colin only smiled. "You'll see." He stepped down from the table, tossing the microphone to one of his followers, and left the cafeteria with his entourage. Some students hesitated before following him, but others stayed put, watching Jaden with a different look in their eyes. Respect. Ava came over quickly, her expression worried. "This smells like a trap." Liam nodded. Colin never does anything without an advantage. If he's calling you to an isolated place, he's planning something. Jaden sighed. I know. But I also know that if I refuse now, he'll use that against me forever. Ava rolled her eyes. Great. So you're playing his game? Jaden looked toward the exit where Colin had disappeared. No, I'm going to turn the tables on him. That night, Jaden found himself mentally rehearsing everything he knew about Colin. He wasn't just a rich, spoiled kid. He was someone used to manipulating the rules to stay on top. That meant the challenge at the warehouse wouldn't be a simple test of skill, but rather a staged psychological game meant to humiliate him. He needed to be prepared for anything. The next day, as he walked down the corridor at St. James, he noticed that the stares on him were even more intense. It seemed everyone already knew about the challenge. Some watched him with curiosity, others with anticipation, as if waiting to see how far he'd go. Ava and Liam met him during the break. Do you still think it's a good idea to go to that warehouse? Ava asked, crossing her arms. Jaden nodded. I have no choice. If I don't go, Colin wins. And if I do, at least I can figure out what he's up to. Liam sighed. I've been asking around. It seems these challenges happen from time to time. It's Colin's way of testing who he considers a threat. Jaden frowned. So he's done this with other people? Liam nodded. Yes, but no one talks about it, which makes me think it didn't end well for the previous challenges. Ava rolled her eyes. Great. So we're dealing with an institutionalized bullying tradition. Jaden clenched his fists. If that's the case, then it's one more reason for me to go. Someone needs to put an end to this farce. Ava and Liam exchanged glances. Liam pulled his phone from his pocket. I checked the school map. The warehouse is in a somewhat isolated area near the old unused football field. There aren't any cameras there, and the night shift security rarely goes by that part. Jaden nodded. In other words, it's the perfect spot for Colin to set something up without getting caught. Ava sighed. Which only confirms it's a trap. The question is, what exactly is he planning? Jaden didn't have that answer yet, but he knew he would soon. When the final bell rang and the school began to empty, he felt a chill in his stomach. The challenge was approaching, and he needed to be ready for whatever came his way. He wasn't sure what he'd find in that warehouse, but one thing was clear. Colin thought he would win, and he was about to prove him wrong. Night fell, and Jaden felt the weight of anticipation as he walked toward the abandoned warehouse. The St. James campus looked different under the faint light of the street lamps. Quieter, more intimidating. The shadows of the buildings cast strange shapes on the ground, and the cold night wind sent shivers down his skin. He knew that this was exactly what Colin wanted, to create an atmosphere of uncertainty, to make him feel as if he was stepping into enemy territory. But Jaden wasn't going to back down. As he approached the warehouse, he noticed the metal door was ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Faint lights flickered inside, and voices could be heard from within. He took a deep breath and stepped in. The warehouse was spacious, with rusty metal beams and wooden crates piled in the corners. In the center, a circle of students had already gathered, like an audience waiting for a show. In their midst, Colin Montgomery stood relaxed, hands in his pockets, a satisfied smile on his face. "Carter, good of you to come," Colin said. Jaden didn't answer immediately. He quickly assessed the situation. There were at least 15 students present, all waiting to see what would happen. Some appeared merely curious, while others were clearly there to root for Colin. He also noticed that Ava and Liam were at the other end of the circle, which reassured him somewhat. "So what's your game, Montgomery?" Jaden asked, folding his arms. Colin smirked. "Simple. A test of courage. If you want to be a part of this school, you need to prove you have what it takes." Jaden snorted. "Funny. I thought I'd already proven that by getting in here." Colin ignored the remark and signaled to one of the boys beside him. The boy pulled out a box and opened its lid, revealing something inside. When Jaden saw what it was, A knot formed in his stomach. Inside the box was a black bag, and from the subtle movement within, it was clear that something alive was inside. "The challenge is simple," Colin said, picking up the bag and holding it aloft. "You need to be locked in this warehouse, alone, with this thing for 15 minutes. If you leave before time's up, you lose." The students murmured, excited by the situation. Jayden kept his eyes fixed on Colin. He knew this wasn't just any challenge. It was a psychological game. "And what exactly is in there?" Jayden asked, his voice steady. Colin shrugged. "Figure it out." The circle of students began to close in, and Jayden realized he had no choice. He could refuse and face the consequences, or accept and show that Colin wouldn't intimidate him. He took a deep breath, looked at Ava and Liam, then said, "Close the door." The game had begun. With a loud metallic clank, the warehouse door closed, and Jayden felt darkness engulf the space. The only light came from a few dimly lit lamps hanging from the ceiling, flickering intermittently. Outside, he could still hear the muffled murmurs and laughter of students waiting to see what would happen. He stared at the black bag that Colin had left on the floor, motionless at first. But then, a slight movement made the fabric ripple, and a low, almost hissing sound escaped from inside. Jayden swallowed hard. He didn't know what was in there, but judging by the way Colin had acted, he knew it wasn't something good. He slowly walked toward the bag and crouched down to get a closer look. The hissing grew louder. Taking a deep breath, he reached out and untied the knot at the top. In the next instant, something inside the bag moved violently, and Jayden jumped back reflexively. The fabric flailed, and from within a snake emerged, slithering out with sinuous movements. Its body glistened under the weak light, and its small, dark eyes fixed on Jayden. "Really, Colin?" Jayden murmured to himself. He wasn't exactly a fan of snakes, but he wasn't one to panic over a reptile either. On closer inspection, he realized it wasn't a venomous snake, probably a young python, placed there just to scare him. From outside, someone banged on the door. "Still alive in there, Carter?" Colin mocked. Jayden took a deep breath. He knew what Colin wanted. He expected him to panic, to scream or bang on the door to be let out, but Jayden wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Calmly, he walked to one corner of the warehouse, sat on the floor, and simply watched the snake move. It seemed more frightened than he was, slithering over the cold concrete in search of a dark corner to hide. "Not bad," Jayden murmured to himself. The minutes passed slowly, and Jayden remained motionless, his mind working. If Colin thought he could break him with cheap tricks, he was mistaken. After a while, a new sound echoed from outside, the ticking of a timer. "5 minutes remaining, scholarship kid," Colin announced, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Jayden did not respond. He just closed his eyes and waited. When the timer finally hit 0, the warehouse door creaked open loudly. Colin was on the other side, surrounded by his entourage, expecting to find Jayden in a panic. But instead, they saw something unexpected. Jayden sitting calmly, staring at them as if nothing had happened. He stood up, gave a slight smile, and walked to the door, stopping next to Colin. "That's it?" Jayden asked. "I thought it would be a real challenge." Colin's expression hardened. He hadn't expected Jayden to come out of there so composed, and in that moment, Jayden realized something important. For the first time, Colin looked uncomfortable. He had won this round. The silence around the warehouse was deafening. More so than any shouting, Jayden could feel all eyes on him, waiting for any reaction. A tremor, a scared look, any sign of weakness. But he remained firm, his eyes locked on Colin, who now appeared less confident than before. Colin's followers exchanged glances, as if trying to figure out what had gone wrong. The plan was simple: lock Jayden in with the snake and wait for him to lose it. But he didn't. He emerged from the warehouse unscathed, calm, as if it had been just another easy school test. Ava and Liam quickly approached him. Ava crossed her arms and smiled. "Well, that was disappointing. I thought this challenge would be something more impressive." Liam looked at Jayden, assessing him. "You knew the snake wasn't venomous, right?" Jaden shrugged. I wasn't sure, but if Colin had put something truly dangerous, he'd have problems himself. He just wanted to scare me. Colin frowned and stepped forward. You think this is over, Carter? Jaden stared him down without blinking. I think you're running out of cards to play. The students around began to whisper. Some laughed softly. The truth was clear. Colin had tried to humiliate Jaden, but ended up exposing himself as someone desperate to keep him under control. Colin clenched his fists, and for a moment, Jaden thought he might try another, more direct, more aggressive approach. But then he took a deep breath, smiled, and stepped back. That was just a warm-up, Carter, Colin said, his voice falsely calm. You might have done well today, but don't be fooled. This game is far from over. He turned and walked away, his group following close behind. Some students hesitated before trailing him, but others stayed, looking at Jaden with something different this time. Respect. Ava let out a theatrical sigh. You know, I really thought he'd explode with rage right there. Liam smiled. Me too. But I think he realized that would only make things worse for him. Jaden looked around and noticed some students whispering to each other, but this time, they didn't seem to be mocking him. There was something different in the way they looked at him, as if he had evolved from a mere challenger into someone worthy of notice. He knew the war with Colin wasn't over, but for now, he had won the first battle. The crowd slowly dispersed, yet the energy in the air was still charged. Jaden knew he had just turned the tables. Colin had tried to humiliate him and failed. And at St. James Academy, where status was everything, public failure was the worst defeat. Ava and Liam walked beside him as they left the campus, and Jaden felt the weight of the night on his shoulders. The adrenaline was starting to fade, and he realized just how tired he was. Yet there was also a sense of accomplishment within him. He knew there was much ahead, but for now he had shown that he wouldn't be easily taken down. When he got home, his mother was already asleep, but he found a covered plate of food on the table with a note. I know you had a long day. Eat something. Love, Mom. Jaden smiled, sitting down to eat. As he chewed, his mind wandered back to the day's events. He thought about Colin, about how he always got everything he wanted. He thought about how, for the first time, someone had publicly challenged him and come out victorious. But above all, he thought about what it all meant. Colin wouldn't give up that easily. That was for sure. But Jaden didn't either. He took his phone and opened the school's social media. As expected, the topic of the night was still the challenge at the warehouse. But to his surprise, amid the sarcastic comments and memes about Colin, there were messages from students he'd never spoken to before. You were amazing today. Finally, someone put Colin in his place. If you need anything, let me know. He never expected people to care so much about it, but it seemed that his resistance had awakened something within St. James. As if by challenging Colin, he had given other students the courage to do the same. He closed his phone and took a deep breath. This was only the first victory. But for the first time since he had set foot in that school, he felt like he belonged. The next morning, Jaden woke up feeling that something had changed, not just within him, but all around. For the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider at St. James Academy. He felt like he was part of the school. Not because everyone had completely accepted him, but because he had earned his space by standing up to Colin Montgomery and walking out with his head held high. When he arrived at the school gates, his intuition was proven right. The atmosphere was different. Eyes followed him as he walked down the corridors, but this time they weren't filled with disdain or contempt. There was curiosity, respect, and in some cases, even admiration. Ava met him in the hallway holding a coffee. Congratulations, scholarship kid. You've officially become a legend. Jaden laughed. If I'd known that facing a snake would make me famous, I would have done it sooner. Liam soon appeared, checking his phone. Did you see social media? Your post has more likes than anything Colin has ever tried to put out about himself. People are even commenting on his old posts, calling him a loser. Jaden raised an eyebrow. So that means he's feeling the hit? Ava smiled. Definitely. And you know what that means, right? Jaden nodded. He's going to try to strike back. And he was right. By the end of the day, Jaden received an anonymous note in his locker. It was a folded piece of paper with no signature. He opened it, expecting yet another provocation from Colin, but what he found was something more threatening. You think you won. This is just the beginning. You have no idea what you're up against. A shiver ran down his spine. The note wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. The message was clear. Colin wasn't backing down. In fact, he was preparing for something even bigger. Jaden folded the paper and tucked it in his pocket. He knew that if he continued challenging the system at St. James, more enemies would appear. But at the same time, he knew that Colin wasn't untouchable. St. James Academy was a game, and he was learning the rules. When he left the school gates that day, he felt something different inside him. He wasn't just a student trying to survive. He was part of something bigger. He had started a change, and once a change begins, it can never be stopped. The end.